week, the 7 last vials have been poured out upon the earth, and things were pretty devastating. Before that, half of the world had already been wiped out, and these 7 vials have basically left the world in ruin. But before we get to the final battle, these next 2 chapters, 17 and 18, look at the fall of Babylon, what that means. Chapter 7 is going to be the religious system of the world, and in chapter 18, the commercial system of the world. And this week we'll focus on the first one, chapter 17, the religious system. And once again, this is kind of a break from a straight chronological read. Right after these bowls of wrath, we have a little break and have a description how the Lord's going to judge the religious system, commercial system, and then finally we'll get to the battle of Armageddon. All right. We'll begin with verses 1 to 3. Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality. And he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads, 10 horns. Begins by telling one of the 7 angels was one of the 7 who had poured the bowls out, what we talked about last week. When describing the upcoming judgment, we have a familiar reference. It seems like whenever in the Bible the Lord is describing to his people disobedience or rebellion or betrayal, he always uses immorality. I guess it's like the ultimate betrayal and sin, and that's the example he seems to use, and that is what he's describing here when we're talking about the harlot, this woman on the beast. Now, from the beginning of this class, we've taken a literal approach to the book of Revelation, but there are cases, when there's clearly symbolic representation here. For example, when we talked about the dragon in chapter 12, we knew that was symbolic for Satan. We don't believe an actual giant red dragon will be here. And likewise, there won't be a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns with a woman, dressed as a harlot on top of it, just roaming through the world. This represents the persecution of God's people all throughout the ages. There's a history of persecution all from the beginning. Don't want to go out of a biblical text, but some of the early traditions that talks about false religion. Of course, before the flood, everything before that event was wiped out, so we know nothing about that world. But after the flood, not long after man began to spread, the tradition is Nimrod started a false religion. Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah, the grandson of Cain. And from his, in that Babylon area, from his false religion, all the false religions of the world spread and have spread throughout the ages. And there's a little bit of the element that they have that are similar to each other, but they have one common theme. They always persecuted God's people. That's consistent all throughout the Old Testament with the children of Israel, and the New Testament and into the church age. They've always, attacked, tried to destroy, kill the people of God, because we know who's behind it to begin with, the enemy, and he wants to destroy God's people. So here we have the description of her, and now as we move chapters 4 to 6, tells a little bit more about it. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adored with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of immorality. Once again, describing immorality describes like the disobedience or the persecution of God's people. Anything rebellious and sinful, and it's trying to make this woman, looks. You think of Jezebel in the Old Testament when you read about this. It just gives you an image of someone who is in complete rebellion against the Lord. And on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of saints, and with the blood of the witness of Jesus. When I saw her, I wondered greatly. This woman, again, is a representation of all the false religions of the world. And as we study this book, and of course we can't know for certain, but we wonder how will this go down in the tribulation period. I've heard one point of view is that most of the persecution being done in these last days will be from the Muslim world. They will play a major role. Personally, I disagree with that. One of the reasons I do, like the Christian faith, the Muslim religion is an exclusive religion. They're not very tolerant to anyone who believes anything other than what they do. Maybe, a few exceptions. And I believe they will be wiped out either by most of these plagues, either by the 7 bowls, 7 trumpets, 7 seals, or maybe even an event that we haven't studied in this book, the battle in Ezekiel 38, 39, which might be right at the beginning or even before the tribulation period. I just know the attitude of the Muslim people and the message the Antichrist will be preaching are in opposition to each other. That doesn't mean they would align with us, the Muslims, but they're not going to fall into this either. So I believe somehow most of their influence will be wiped out. 20 years ago, when 9/11 hit, that to me, you asked me what is the biggest threat in the world, and I would say Islam right away. And they just don't seem to have the punch that they used to. It seems like we've really, in the last couple of decades, have really took a big hit out of them. Now, they're still a threat. They still exist. But I always thought the biggest threat to the world won't be the Muslim religion, but will be the religion of man, humanism. We're God, and we don't need a religious leader. And that seems to be the message that the Antichrist will have. So I don't believe it will be of Islamic influence. There is a tradition of the 12th Imam emerging in Muslim teaching that he will come back, bring Jesus with him. Jesus will tell everybody, I wasn't the Son of God, and that's Islam teaching. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with the Muslim movement as we move in these last days and false religion. The apostate church or ecumenical movement will, however, I believe, be a strong part of this. That's the movement that might be Christian in name, but their philosophy is, that's my belief. You're Buddhist, you're Hindu, you're Muslim, whatever. Let's just get along with each other. Okay? That sounds nice, but in the end we know that doesn't work because people who have not been changed by Jesus don't get along with each other, and there'll always be conflict. I thought of a humorous comic strip in one of the magazines that gets Answers in Genesis, and it showed a bunch of people from that movement protesting the Ark or the Creation Museum, and one of them had like this violent thing against the museum, and on the shirt had that coexist shirt. If anyone's seen, has all the symbols of the false religion. So it's kind of saying, even though his shirt says coexist, he's protesting the very thing that he's proclaiming to have. And to me, it's nothing more annoying than a person who claims at least to have a base in Christianity and would have an attitude like it doesn't matter what you believe, everybody's going to be okay in the end. And that's what the secular world teaches today. You can be as religious as you want, but the moment you mention Jesus as the only way to heaven, you're immediately attacked in this country by the media. I think of our 2 presidential candidates. One claims to be a Catholic, and the media's all for that. Say he's a good Catholic, and why do you religious people vote? Why would you not vote for him when the other person is a heathen? Well, as far as Donald Trump being a heathen, I believe the Lord's working on him and gradually changing him. But my main point of that would be, don't judge a person by what he says as much as what he does, and look at their life's actions. But the point being, most on the left are fine with you being religious as long as you keep your religion to yourself. But when you say your religion stuff like, I prohibit abortion, or I'm against homosexuality, then you will see how quickly the systems of this world will just pile down on you and just begin, to increase their verbal form of persecution. And as we read in Revelation, it will get to even physical persecution, and even exists around. And of course, today, even outside the world, many Christians are being persecuted just for being a Christian. So we know that that's happening. This describes it, but it's also describing it's coming towards an end. Verse 7, and the angel said to me, why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which is the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And we're in that phrase again. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to come up out of the abyss and go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, will wonder when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. Let me just stop right there. What does that mean? All those who dwell on the earth, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. I don't believe this teaching predestiny or anything. There is, my personal point of view is this. We certainly have our own will. I think I mentioned even in another lesson, we certainly have our own free will to choose whether we serve the Lord or not. But whatever choice we make, the Lord knows that. And from that perspective, our names are written in the book of life from the foundation of the world. But we also had a warning in to the letter to one of the churches that he will take your name out of the book of life. So I heard one preacher teach that everyone's name is there in the beginning, and then when you make your decision whether or not you'll follow the Lord, it's taken out of that. Either one could be the case, but just wanted to comment briefly on that. Back to the text, verse 9. Here is a mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 has fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. So let's talk about these 4 verses again. Once again, we have a description of the woman on the beast, and it is explained what this beast is. A familiar phrase is used, 7 heads and 10 horns. That's 2 or 3 times in this chapter. If you want to flip back a couple chapters to Revelation 13. And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. So when the Antichrist rises in Revelation 13, we have this description of a beast, 7 heads, 10 horns. And then when this the harlot of Babylon described, the same thing's being described here. Basically, they come from the same world system. So this same world system that produces the beast also produces this persecution of God's people. Little tricky phrase here. I want to go back to what beginning of verse 8. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come. What does that mean? I was going through several commentaries. It was hard to get a definite answer, just a few suggestions. One of the things I always thought, could that refer to the Antichrist? Remember we talked about the massive head wound he receives and his recovery for that. Does that mean like he was supposedly dead and has returned? Does it mean one of the past empires that we're about to discuss? That's a suggestion. So I really don't know. I'm sure it's making a reference to he's coming from one of these 7 nations that we're about to talk about, but just an area that a little complicated, so I don't really know how to expand on it more. I heard one person teach that, who had the belief that the Muslims will be doing the primary persecution of the world, that Babylon existed in the past. At the time of this writing, it didn't exist, and in the time to come, it will exist again with the rule of the Antichrist. That was just one example of what that could be. My view on that, I don't believe that. I guess my opinion would be, at the time of this writing, this wasn't existent, but the time will come, he'll rise up again. This was written, all right, also as a result of this, verse 9, the 7 heads or 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Many believe this references Rome as a result of verse 9, because the Roman Empire sits on 7 hills, the city of Rome. So that's a possible reference. And but it also refers to 7 world empires as it led up to this point. And verse 10 says, 7 kings, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other's not yet come. When he comes, he must remain a little while. Running out of space here, but let's go over the 7 empires again. All right, the first is Egypt, one of the first major kingdoms after the flood, very prominent in biblical history. Of course, we had Abraham first went down there, and then Joseph, Jacob, the children of Israel, the Exodus, and they persecuted the church. And a lot of times when the Bible makes symbolic references to sin, it refers back to Egypt. Next came Assyria, very, very wicked people. What do they have in common? They persecuted the children of Israel, and they captured the northern tribes, carried them off into captivity, and to this day they're known as the lost tribes. After Assyria, now we'll get into the area of Daniel and the statue, Babylon. And when you think of Tower of Babel, that's because it's the same area, and I'm sure that's where they derived the name. King Nebuchadnezzar, as Assyria took the northern tribes, Babylon took the southern tribes captive of Israel. But the difference with them is they returned. Anyone remember the story of Daniel with the writing on the wall? You know, they were sitting in town hall, partying, revelry, and drinking with the temple instruments. Big no-no there. And then all of a sudden a hand writes on the wall and says, tonight you'll be judged. And Daniel interprets a dream, and those who come after them are the ones who invade that night, the Medes and Persians. So that's number 4. And they all have a theme. Egypt initially put children of Israel in captivity. Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persians. From this came Darius, Cyrus, and the return of Israel, or Judah, back to the Promised Land. And we get into the intertestament period, so we don't have a biblical text, but the time in between the testaments. Next is Greece. We've all heard of Alexander the Great. This is where he was ruling, conquered the world, and he had a part of an interaction with the children of Israel. Then finally, number 6, the monster Roman Empire. And as you study Daniel, and if we get into the Daniel, even though that did not exist at the time he was writing it, you'll see at the time it was one of the mightiest of all. So, at the writing of Revelation at the end of the 1st century, so there are 7 kings. All right, 5 have fallen. Egypt at this time was no longer a threat, or wasn't what it was. Assyria gone, Babylon gone, Medo-Persia gone, Greece gone, Rome. 1 is. That's what it says. 5 have fallen, 1 is. It's the Roman Empire, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. Now, like I said, this is Revelation. This isn't Daniel, but we're going to talk about Daniel a little bit in the statue. But the 7th one is more than likely the 10 kingdoms that will come out of this Roman Empire. Many of the popular term used all in prophecy teaching from our persuasion is the revived Roman Empire. And this also goes with that massive statue in Daniel that describes 5 of these here, not the first 2, because they had already occurred even during the book of Daniel. So let's continue to read 11 through 13. The beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th one, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. So we have an 8th beast. He's of the 7, so that means basically he came from the world system. And number 8, I'm going to write this backwards, is, of course, Antichrist. And he is of all 7 of these, basically saying all the world systems he has come out of there. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. They have one purpose, and they give their power and their authority to the beast. All right, some comment on that. Verse 11 is describing the Antichrist. He is of the 7 in the sense that he comes from the world system. We are told of his fate. He will eventually go into destruction. This section here seems to imply that 10 kings or provinces or nations will form an alliance during the tribulation period. And what I'd like to do here is take a brief look back at the book of Daniel. And kind of see that these message of 10 kings have been spoken about before. I'm going to go to Daniel 2. And he begins to interpret to Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was and what it means. Verse 31, chapter 2, verse 31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. The statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold. So the head, right there, fine gold. Its breast and its arms of silver, that's next. And 2 arms, sometimes they would represent Medes, Persians. Its belly and its side bronze, that would be Greece. Its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So iron, Roman Empire, which didn't even exist when Daniel wrote this book, or was just a small territory then. You continued looking until the stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Of course, that would be the kingdom of God, which will destroy all kingdoms of the world. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth, talking about the kingdom of God then, which will spread everywhere. I want to continue a little bit more in Daniel 2, verses 40 to 43, where he talks about Rome. I remember Daniel's given this vision around 500 BC, and Rome is just, not even known existence. I mean, it had been founded then, but it was no way a threat to world peace. But here's what Daniel 2, 40 to 43 says about it. Then there will be a 4th kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break through all these in pieces. Rome spread it all throughout the whole world. What was the old saying? All roads lead to Rome. They just went out and conquered everything. And that you saw the feet and toes. Now here we get to the 10 kingdoms, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom, but will have in the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. We're not here to talk about, get into Daniel. That can mean all types of things, but I just wanted to show you, we have a reference to these 10 kingdoms back in Daniel, and it appears this 7th kingdom during the book of Revelation will come out of the 6th kingdom. You want to know here, these kings are connected to the 2 legs, whichever one agreed is Rome. Many teach that all 10 of these must come from the revived Roman Empire, for the old Roman Empire. About, I think even as early as the 1950s and 60s, there was a talk of a European Union or a common market, and the nations one by one started to join, and I believe it was in the early 80s that the 10th nation joined, and that really, got people thinking, is this the, is this the revived Roman Empire in Revelation? But eventually 11th joined, 12th, and now they're 20 or 30. This is, by the way, the one that you all heard of Brexit, what Britain got out of. So this apparently is not, but it could be a precursor of what could come. I've heard others teach because of the 2 different feet, 5 toes on each foot, that from the five are from the Eastern Empire, 5 are from the West, and some have even suggested that the globe will be divided into 10 regions. I've even seen like an example, like North America be one, South America, Eastern Europe, Western Europe. They're all possible scenarios. I would lean, I guess, toward the traditional interpretation that they will come from the Roman Empire, because it just seems to flow with the statue and the prophecies. But times will tell. But that's my opinion of that. And I also want to go to the reference, 1 hour. They will receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. Of course, that's not literally 1 hour, just like when we talked about Daniel's 70 weeks is not 1 week. That's kind of just a symbolic representation of a very short time. And we know that really can't be much more than 3.5 years based on the events that are occurring here. But these 10 kingdoms, they will surrender all of their authority to the Antichrist, giving him more power. So, from a one sense, he's conquering, he's gaining, territories from all over the world. But at the other time, the whole world's falling apart with plagues, diseases, and things of that nature. So he just said, so it's all building up to a gigantic climax. But this chapter, chief focus is on the persecution of God's people. And that's how it closes out in the final verses 14 to 18. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate, naked, and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman who you saw is a great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. So as we close out chapter 17, we ask the question, who's being persecuted? Of course, God's people. All throughout the book of Revelation, they've seemed to be, are faced the enemy, knowing he has a short time, is thrown all he has at them. The question arises, is it the church? Is it the tribulation saints? Whoever it is, there will be people serving the Lord, and they will be persecuted by unbelievers in this time. But there's one thing different this time. Unbelievers have problems of their own as the Lord is pouring his wrath out upon them. This is the culmination of it. Since the beginning, from righteous Abel, who Cain killed in the Garden of Eden, or at least in that area, up until this time, God's people have always been persecuted. In the Old Testament, the children of Israel were usually brought about by their own rebellion, but this existed. Then came the church age, and immediately Rome persecuted the church, and that's the story leading up to today, All over the world, people all are being persecuted for the Christian faith, just for the simple crime of believing in Jesus. But let's look back at verse 14. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. This verse gives us hope that eventually this persecution will end, and by the time we're getting to this point, basically, the Lord's saying, it's over now, I'm pouring out my final judgments. From my own personal opinion, what I would think is that as you're getting toward the end of this tribulation period, the plagues, the destruction, the devastation will be so bad towards the end that persecution will no longer be an issue at the end, because there's just, everyone is just basically trying to survive. And the key emphasis during this time also seems like the Antichrist and his forces will be focusing in on closing in on Jerusalem for one final more battle. So if you're in the tribulation and you've got to this point, this might be a time where you can say, looks like we can coast now towards the end, because all the devastation has been done, and there's nothing left now but wait for the Lord's return. Verse 16 also seems to imply the beast, or the Antichrist, he himself will devour this representation of false religion. Let's go over that again. What we're talking about, this woman, the harlot on the beast. It says, in the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. So even though this has been the tool that the enemy has used all throughout the ages to persecute God's people, in the end, they himself turn on her and destroy her. So these false religions of the world will just, are the representation of it. They'll just come in and collapse and kill it themselves. I guess this basically means that the Antichrist then will say there are no other religions, we don't coexist. Now, there is no religion. I'm the only person worth serving, and he'll have his 10 kings devour this false church. I've heard in the past that the last pope will be the false prophet. I've also heard that the false prophet will destroy the last pope leading this ecumenical movement. That's just speculation. Of course, it's not in here, but they're just some of the many suggestions. But whatever the case, the false religious systems of this world will be destroyed as well, and at the end it will just be two forces: the people of God and the people who follow the beast, or the Antichrist. Now it closes out in verse 18 by saying, "The woman who you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth." I looked it up. What does this mean? Does this mean Jerusalem? That was a symbolic. When we go back to Revelation 11 and the 2 witnesses and the earthquake, it says this is Babylon as a nickname, but it was talking about the place where our Lord was crucified. Some say it's actually literal Babylon. Some teach that Babylon in the area which is Iraq now will actually be built up again. But instead I view it as judgment on the world's false religions. Among them, and perhaps judged the most of all, is the apostate church. During this time, the Lord will judge Islam for their false teaching and for the wicked things they've done, and other Eastern religions like Hinduism and Buddhism that don't teach God as an actual person, but like a force or a being. But maybe most of all, he'll persecute the apostate church, who will give more accountability than those who know better, and those who claim to follow Jesus, to read his word, to know what it says in here, and to in spite of knowing that, not telling people that, and even encourage them to live their own sinful lifestyles. I believe they will be judged the most at the time. So as we come to the judgment of the world's religious systems, this basically wipes it out. And by the time we get to this point, I believe you just have two people: those who are following God and those who are following the Antichrist. And through all these judgments and wrath, these have been weeded out, the wheats and the tares, and that's what this chapter focuses on. Next chapter again uses the symbolic term or reference of Babylon, but it will talking about its judgment on the commercial and economic system, which we'll go into next week. Well, that's how we wrap up chapter 7. the woman who is persecuted, woman representing the persecution of the church all throughout the ages, or God's people, she will be destroyed, and God's people at last will have victory and will overcome. So we'll close it there. And anyone have any comments, questions, disagreements? All things are welcome. Finished a little early this week.
I heard where a teacher was sentenced. I don't know how to say it, but they how you say decapitated?
Cut her head off, that's one way of saying it.
Yeah, for her teaching. I don't know if that was Islam
Pretty sure it was.
this week, and
Yeah, I think I heard about it too. She made some references. Now, some have said because of, talking about believers being beheaded, I don't know if we got to that verse yet, and the Muslim world likes to do that. They have linked those two together, and it is possible, they could have a strong influence in the last days, but I just know their basic belief and their, exclusiveness, and it's just Islam or nothing else. Just hard to see them falling in and going into the beast world system. That is, unless they believe the Antichrist is a Muslim, and that's what some people teach. I don't believe that view. I believe he'll just be secular. He won't believe in any religion, but he'll promote himself and the devil who is, indwelling him. Any other thoughts? All right. Lord, we thank you for this lesson this week. Lord, just thank you for your faithfulness to your children all throughout the years. We pray that you be with our persecuted brothers and sisters around the world, even this morning, and give them all the hope that soon you will return, you will put an end to all this, and you will bring in everlasting righteousness in your kingdom. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.